Hey, welcome back to For the Defense. My name is David Oscar Markus, and we have a special bonus episode for you today with attorney Todd Blanche. You may have seen Todd's name all over the news recently. He's representing the former President Donald Trump in his New York State case, as well as his federal case down here in the Southern District of Florida. Todd is a wonderful lawyer, was at a large New York law firm, and now is on his own representing the former president. He's also represented in the past Paul Manafort, and that's what we're going to talk about today, but you'll see it bleeds into his representation of the former president as well. Todd hasn't given media interviews, hasn't been out there in the press, so we're very thankful he agreed to sit down and discuss really the origin story of how he got involved in the Trump case and the very political defense representations that he's taken on. So welcome to For the Defense. Here's Todd Blanche next. Thanks. Okay, we're here with Todd Blanche. I'm really excited for this interview. Todd is a wonderful criminal defense lawyer. You may have seen him in the news lately. We're going to talk not about that case, but about some of his prior cases. And I just want to welcome you to the show, Todd. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here, David.
So, typically we talk about great trials and trial wins, but it's even better to win pre-trial, which you did in the Paul Manafort case. So I'd like to talk to you about the Paul Manafort case. You were at a big law firm in New York when you handled that case, right?
Yes, I was at Cadwalader. And I like everybody else, I saw the news that suggested that New York was the New York County, as opposed to the federal government who had charged Mr. Manafort in DC and in Virginia, that they were going to indict him. And there was a lot of drama around that. And I was at a big law firm doing what all of us do, doing what you do, and was approached by a lawyer who I had worked with for a long time when I was a prosecutor, and asked whether I would be interested in representing Mr. Manafort in the New York case, not the federal case.
It's interesting because, we grew up in the federal system. I was a PD, you were a prosecutor in the federal system. It's always interesting to appear in state court when you grew up in the federal system. At least in Florida, the state courts down here it's like going to a cattle call, like a zoo.
Oh, David, you're totally right. I will tell you something. The first time I appeared in Manhattan Supreme Court was for that case. I had never appeared in Manhattan Supreme Court. And as you probably know, the federal court in downtown Manhattan is right across the street from the state court. And so proximity is right there. But it's like a whole nother world. And any lawyer that practices and that's listening can probably relate to this. I walked in there and had no idea what I was doing. What I did, actually, a very quick, funny story. When I did get the case and I knew that Mr. Manafort was going to come get arraigned in Manhattan Supreme Court, I went over just to watch some cases. You've had several guests talk about the value of just going into a courtroom and seeing what's going on. And I had been a federal prosecutor. I had been a paralegal for 7 years at the U.S. Attorney's Office and at the Department of Justice. So I had seen plenty of courtrooms, but never in Manhattan Supreme Court. And I had a professor in law school who was a judge. And so I thought to myself, I'll just go over there and I'll watch a couple of proceedings in front of him. I'll just sit in the back. And I did. And unfortunately, when I walked into the judge's courtroom, I didn't introduce myself. It's a public courtroom. We do live in America. And I sat in the back, and the ADA walked out and looked at me very suspiciously. And then the defense attorney walked in and looked at me very suspiciously. And then the defendant came out with two guards. The defendant was incarcerated. And then the defendant looked at me very suspiciously. And I was the only person in the gallery, and I was just there to see what happened. I had no agenda. I just want to see how this worked in state court. The judge takes the stand, and the bench rather, and he doesn't know who I am. I went to law school, 20 years earlier. He looks at me suspiciously, and he calls the parties up, and they all start whispering to each other. And then the ADA, the assistant district attorney, came out and asked me who I was. And they really have no right to do that. I'm allowed to sit in a courtroom with Democrats, but it turns out, as I quickly realized, I think it was a person who was pleading guilty pursuant to a cooperation agreement, and they didn't want anybody in the courtroom, and they thought maybe that I was, a defense attorney for a co-defendant or something. So I said to the ADA, I'll just leave. Like, I'm not trying to create a ruckus.
Right.
And so I did. So that was my first experience, actually, just trying to sit through a proceeding in Manhattan Supreme Court. I later watched a bunch of arraignments and whatnot. So yes, it was a whole new world.
That is a great story. It is funny when you appear in a courtroom like that and everybody's like, "Who's that guy?" So you're at the big law firm at the time. It is interesting, just as a detour. When I first started in private practice, I don't know, it was in the early 2000s. The big firms did not do white collar work. I mean, it was very rare. And now all the big firms have a white collar division, and they're all hiring former prosecutors and former defenders, and it's much different market than it used to be. It's pretty nuts.
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. I think, I was a prosecutor in the Southern District of New York, and most of us, when we leave, go to a kind of a big firm, or at least a mid-sized to large firm, because they now have very robust white collar practices. And it wasn't always like that. And look, I loved Cadwalader. I still love Cadwalader. I'm not there now because of my current representation of President Trump, but it was a great firm with a really great white collar practice. And they took a chance on Mr. Manafort. They really did, because he was a very polarizing figure at the time. And I think everybody in America, maybe not everybody in America, but those in America that knew who he was, had very strong views of him. And that was a risk. And I still am very grateful for the firm for letting me do the case. But you're totally right. Big firm and like traditional white collar work, or even, any kind of criminal prosecution is a recent phenomenon for sure.
I'll tell you one of the things that bothered me about the Manafort case, and it bothers me about the current case that you're involved in, is the number of different indictments, right? So Manafort was charged in Virginia, in DC, and then of course in state court in New York. And really, as an individual defendant, it's impossible to defend 3 cases in 3 different places, 3 different jurisdictions. He had the guts to go to trial and won. But I guess that's what formed the basis of your defense in the New York case, is the double jeopardy claim, right?
Oh, right, exactly. No, and look, not to get into the moral or ethical or reasons why we take cases, but what you said is exactly why I wanted to do that case. And and that's also why I'm doing the case I'm doing now involving President Trump, is that I do, it did mean something to me that he had been really put through hell. Putting aside guilt or innocence for a moment, just put through hell in the DC process. He had been indicted in the Eastern District of Virginia, and then separately indicted in DC. He was put in jail. He was incarcerated, which is quite unusual for somebody charged with the types of crimes he was charged with, and given where he was in his life. So he was sitting in prison. He did go to trial. And he really did. He hung most of the counts in the Eastern District of Virginia. The government had put a tremendous amount of pressure on him to cooperate and to plead guilty in D.C. His entire life savings and trusts that he had left for his children had been seized. And so they really had and you talk about this a lot in your podcast, but the power that the government has is really extraordinary. And when they choose to use it, it's very hard to, it's David and Goliath, I think, even if you're somebody who's wealthy and had, even had political connections like Mr. Manafort. And so when I saw that the district attorney in Manhattan was going to indict him for the same crimes, I was really, really, really offended as a lawyer, right? As someone who had been a prosecutor. You were a federal defender or a public defender. You want to like the system you're working in. You want to be proud of it. You want to be able to say, like, justice works. Doesn't work every time, but it works. Overall it works. And when I saw that happen to him, I felt like justice didn't work, and it wasn't working. And so when I had the opportunity to represent him, I leaped at it. And it was funny, like, not to get into the everybody, when they knew he was indicted, everybody said there's this unique law in New York, which is different than the federal system and different than most states as it relates to double jeopardy. So double jeopardy, everybody knows what it is. You can't be tried for the same crime twice. But under the federal standard, as the Supreme Court has held, it's very difficult for double jeopardy to apply. It really has to be very similar facts, similar elements. And so you can say to yourself, geez, I feel like I'm getting tried for the same crime. And oftentimes in the federal system, the answer is no, it's a little bit different. So we're going to allow you to be charged. New York has a different rule. The Constitution of New York gives a lot more protection to individuals for double jeopardy. And so I looked at the case. I looked at what we expected the indictment to be, and at the time we didn't know what the district attorney was going to do, but it looked like it would potentially be a double jeopardy problem. And then when he was indicted, there was no surprises, right? Like, it was a double jeopardy problem, and everybody kind of knew it. Like, and David, you go on TV, you talk to the press and you talk to the public and try to explain complicated issues in ways that everybody can understand. And I remember watching any news, whether it's a kind of a liberal bend or a conservative bend, and everybody was kind of, shaking their heads like, this seems like it could be a problem. And it turns out it was. So
I want to talk to you a little about that. But before we get into it, just so folks, are oriented right, can you tell us a little about who Paul Manafort was and is, and just generally the big picture, what the charges were?
Sure. So Paul Manafort, a lifelong consultant, very, very successful in the area of politics and international consulting, worked for Republicans and Democrats throughout his entire life, and had achieved just a lot of great things for all kinds of countries and governments and companies and individuals. And he was a very successful man, and he was a success story. He worked for President Trump's campaign effort for a pretty brief period of time, 4 or 5 months, 5 or 6 months. So not a long time. And as everybody remembers, at the time, there were a bunch of reports that came out about improper contacts, supposedly, between the Trump campaign and Russia. And Russia and Mr. Manafort had some work with Russia over the years. And so he immediately stepped down because he didn't want to hurt President Trump's chances of getting elected. And everything moves forward. The election happens. And then we all know what happens with Russia and the Mueller report and the investigation. And it turns out they found that they ended up going after Mr. Manafort, not for anything involving Russia at all, but for mortgage fraud and basically mortgage fraud in kind of the traditional sense that he had not he had lied to the banks when applying for mortgages about his assets and how much money he had. And then there was in DC some violations of FARA. But it was a pretty complicated case, and not a case I think folks that even the prosecutors themselves would hopefully admit that in the normal time you wouldn't indict somebody for what he was accused of doing, because the mortgages were performing, right? And what I mean by that, David, is let's assume that you get a mortgage for a house and you're not honest about how much you're worth. You get $1 million mortgage and you say that you have $1 million in assets, and it turns out you only have $600,000 in assets. Bank doesn't know it. The bank gives you the mortgage, and you're paying your mortgage every month. So have you committed a federal crime? Yeah. Yes, you have, right? You've lied to the bank about a very important question, which is your net worth. And that led them to do something they wouldn't otherwise do, give you the mortgage. And so, geez, you're a criminal. But let's say you're performing on that mortgage, meaning you're making your monthly payments every month. Normally, even if the feds learn that you committed this horrible lie, it's not something they're going to spend resources going after you, because you're paying on your mortgage.
Right.
right?
I mean, there should be some prosecutorial discretion in what cases prosecutors bring, right? There's only a certain number of prosecutors, only a certain number of resources, only a certain number of cases they can bring. I mean, it would seem to me if you're performing on the mortgage, if there's no harm, if there's no victim, maybe that's not the case that should be brought. There's other ways to deal with it, right?
Yeah, yeah. And look, I'm not speaking ill of the prosecutors and or even of what happened. I think it's been so long and we've moved on. But certainly at the time, there was a feeling that he had gotten railroaded. He had gotten, big sentences in both. He had gotten sentenced in Virginia and in D.C., where he ultimately pled guilty. And was facing real federal time. He was an older man at the time. I believe he was 70 or around 70, and was looking at losing a big chunk of his life because of this. And then on top of all that, he gets indicted in New York for what amounts to be exactly the same mortgage fraud I just described, meaning under New York law, not surprising, they have similar laws that don't allow you to misstate things on mortgage applications. And so he was indicted for that. And when I met him, you asked about who he was or who he is. He had been in prison for a long time. He had gone through a trial, and you've interacted and you've worked and you have clients and people that who have served time in prison. It breaks a person, or it can break a person. And so I remember the first time I met him in Alexandria, Virginia, when he was in prison. You had seen the photos of him and read articles about him and seen him at the convention and speaking. And he was not that person. He was not that person. I liked him. I like him a lot. He's still a friend of mine. I saw him, last week. We got together. We talk on the phone. From the first time I met him, I liked him. But he was a kind of a broken man. He had been in federal prison, for a long time.
It's interesting, Todd, because you were a prosecutor, and I'm always interested because prosecutors who become defense lawyers like you, real defense lawyers who represent real people and see it now from a different side, it is interesting, right? Because when you were a prosecutor, you don't really get to know the person you're prosecuting. You read about them, like you say, you see them, you see the bank forms or whatever it is. But when you're a defense lawyer, like, this is a real person with a real family who's trying to figure out how to defend on three different fronts. I think, when you and I were talking before, when you saw him in the MDC, which is one of the worst jails there is, tell us a little about that. I mean, you have to meet somebody in a terrible place like that.
Yeah, sure. So it was the MCC, which the Metropolitan
right.
Correctional Center, which is located in Lower Manhattan. And for those that don't know, where that is or what that's like, it's right next to the U.S. Attorney's Office and right next to the federal court, and you can actually get to both places without going outside. So it's literally connected to the federal court in Manhattan and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan. And historically, it's a very it's where a lot of very, very dangerous men have been when they were waiting for trial. The terrorism cases in Southern District of New York, mob cases, cases with individuals. So it has a very secure part of the prison where they keep individuals who pose a security risk or who they view as being potentially dangerous. And so it's this structure. It almost looks like an apartment building, but much, much worse. So it's not what you imagine with a federal prison that's kind of a bunch of barracks spread out over acres and acres. It's just literally in Lower Manhattan. It's closed now, by the way, but at the time it was not. And so what happened was, Mr. Manafort gets indicted and he has to get arraigned. So he's serving his federal prison sentence. He's in Loretto, Pennsylvania. It's about a 3.5, 4-hour drive from Lower Manhattan. And he's going to get arraigned. It was at some point in June, late June, early July 2019. So the marshals bring him to New York so he can be arraigned in state court. But he's a federal prisoner, right? Because he had been convicted in federal court. And so he's going to be housed at the MCC in Lower Manhattan. And then, like what would happen practically speaking, and what did happen is the state law enforcement would go and pick him up from federal prison across the street and drive him over, a block or two to be arraigned. But he's in the MCC, and they put him in that very secure area that I described, David, which is called 9 South. And it has housed, some of the folks that we view as some of the most dangerous people that our justice system has ever prosecuted. At the time, he was there, and later on, which I can get to in a minute, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested shortly thereafter and was there, and then the drug dealer, the drug kingpin El Chapo, who was on trial in Brooklyn at the time. But because the system, because the jail in Manhattan is so secure and can support, that type of a defendant or an inmate, he was housed at the MCC as well. So and when you go to visit, and you've done this, David, thousands of times more than I have, but you go into the jail, it's very difficult to get in. It's it's all that you would expect. And what happened was a very funny story, which I think I've always said it's one of the unique highlights of my professional life, is I went after the arraignment. I went on a Sunday to visit Mr. Manafort. So he had been arraigned and he's waiting to go back to Loretto. And I show up on a Sunday, and normally when you go to visit an inmate in this 9 South, in the super secure area, they take you to this little interview room and they lock you in and you get to speak with your client. But because it was a weekend, it was a Sunday, we went to the normal visiting area. But it was a secure area that day because I was going to go visit Mr. Manafort. And so they had said that I could come at a particular time. And I went up, and Mr. Manafort had just been arraigned, and he knew we now had a briefing schedule. We were going to talk about what we're going to do and strategize. And I was going to get him ready to go and let him know that we were going to fight for him. And I walked in the visiting area, and there's 3 rooms when you walk in the attorney conference area at the MCC in Lower Manhattan. Glass windows so that the guards can observe what's happening, and they can't hear, but they can observe. And I walk in and I see Mr. Manafort right in the middle waiting for me. They had brought him in before I had arrived.
Right.
And to the left, when I'm facing him, is Jeffrey Epstein sitting there.
Oh,
and he had just gotten arrested, and he had a bail argument the very next day in front of the Judge Berman, the district court judge assigned to him. And there were 2 lawyers there visiting with him, presumably getting ready for that argument. And then I look to the right, and to the right is El Chapo. And sitting there with his a woman who was one of his legal team. I don't know whether she was a lawyer or a paralegal. And so I remember thinking to myself then, and I've thought to myself hundreds of times since then, this is a crazy life, right? I mean, I went to night law school. I worked during the day. And here I am sitting in this prison on a Sunday morning. My wife went to Little Italy to wait for me so we could have lunch afterwards. And I see El Chapo, and then I see Mr. Epstein, and then I see Paul Manafort. And anyway, man, it was one of those.
What a crazy story, and it is true. Like, people don't realize how surreal our job is, and what we do. Just being in the jail with Manafort himself was probably surreal enough, and then you have Epstein and El Chapo bookending you. It's nuts. I don't think I've told this story before on the podcast, but I represented Ghislaine Maxwell on appeal for her bail appeal, and I went and visited her once. It's at MDC in Brooklyn. That's why I messed up and said MDC. And that jail is also insane and highly secure and awful for reasons we can discuss at another time. But I went on a weekend also and got in there, and because of what happened with Epstein, there was a crew that followed Ghislaine around wherever she went with a camera 24/7. They had a handheld camera. Even when I was meeting with her in the little room, they sat outside the room with a camera. Yeah. I had never experienced anything like it. And it was surreal. And it just, these stories. And one of the reasons I like doing this podcast is because I get to speak with people like you who have these incredible, surreal stories.
Yeah, it was surreal. I still think about that. And, like I said, I think Mr. Manafort is a great man. I really do. He's a client, of course, but he's a friend. And he was going through something at the time that, here he was facing 7 years in federal prison. And now the district attorney in New York wants to send him to jail for even longer. And the problem with that case, David, at the risk of being Captain Obvious, is he had already been convicted of that conduct. So mounting a defense for that case, had it gone to trial, you could have been successful, but I certainly didn't like my chances. So
it seems like an uphill battle to fight a case where there's already a conviction. I have to say, I wrote about this at the time of his sentencing after trial. It really bothered me that the government asked for, I think it was like a 20-year sentence after trial. And for someone like him on a case where there was performance on the loans and everything, it just seems so outrageous to me, and such an example, like the perfect example of the trial penalty, right? Like, had Manafort pled in that case and cooperated or whatever, even if he pled without cooperation, the government would never have asked for 20 years. It's just, it was a pure trial tax. And it bothered me. And there were people out there saying, well, he went to trial and lost. What's wrong? That's what the sentencing guidelines call for. It bothered me.
Yeah, totally. I mean, look, I think, and you've talked about this on your podcast a lot, those of us that have been prosecutors, I think it's hard not to lose. I think sometimes we lose perspective, and I hope I have it now. You say to somebody, I'm going to offer you, let's say they're looking at 10 years in prison, and you say, I'll offer you 5. That's a great deal. So, on the one hand, that's half the time in prison. On the other hand, that's 5 Christmases. That's 5 years of their life that they do not get to really interact or know their family, their friends, their loved ones. And I remember, and there's some prosecutors that are very cavalier. I even put myself in that, where you would say to somebody, look, I'm offering you an amazing deal. If you go to trial, you're going to get 10 years, and I'm offering you 5 years. And you wonder why they don't, jump up and thank you profusely. Well, it's because it's 5 years of their life, and it's really, I hope I hope that I never lose that perspective again. And now that I have it, because, we see it all the time in our clients. When you talk about going to jail or serving a term of incarceration, really even a few months, even a year, 2 years, 4 years, 7 years, that's a tremendous amount of time to, that you're going to be away from your family and friends and loved ones. So,
well, Todd, you mentioned, when you were a prosecutor at what they call the Sovereign District of New York, or the Southern District. That's what they like to say there. But even those prosecutors who are, I recently had a case there, really smart folks. By the way, I made the mistake when I went to trial in your district. I didn't know any better, so I figured I'd book a hotel at the closest hotel, and I ended up at a hotel in Chinatown, a couple blocks from the federal courthouse. I should have called you first, because that was a mistake.
That was a mistake. It was a mistake.
Yeah. Everybody laughs like you are when I tell them that story. And I tried that case with a friend, Sean Hecker, who, when he first came to the hotel, asked me what the hell I was thinking when I booked there. So I should have called you guys. First. But maybe what we should do, because I don't think it's because of any ill will or evil intentions where prosecutors say, this is a great deal, I'm offering you 5 years instead of 10. I think it's just because they haven't represented people before, right? So a lot of times prosecutors are young, right out of law school or right out of a clerkship, and they just don't have the perspective of what 5 years means. And so I wonder if there's a solution. Maybe one of the things we could consider is, this will never happen, of course, but having prosecutors do a year of federal defense first, or public defense first, or just representing some people first. I bet the offers would change pretty quickly if that happened.
I agree. No, I totally agree. I mean, you look at, I think the military does that, right? There's a lot of the JAG Corps system. You flip back and forth, and that's not exactly aligned. But look, I was in the violent crimes unit when I was a prosecutor, and so I did mostly federal robberies and federal murder cases, and then I supervised the unit as well. And those are really, I think we would all agree, really bad crimes, especially the federal system. They're really probably the worst. Well, not the worst, I will say that, but they're bad crimes. And even there, the amount of time that the federal sentencing guidelines, put on a judge to make a decision about, even if there's not a mandatory minimum, it's just a tremendous amount of time, but anyway, I think that's for a much longer discussion. But yes, I do agree that one thing is for certain, and you've probably seen this throughout your career, when a prosecutor leaves, like I did, you very quickly get a wake up call and realize that
Yeah.
maybe there's another perspective out there. So
let me ask you this, Todd, because I wonder if your perspective on this has changed as well. When I've dealt with prosecutors, especially in high profile cases like Manafort and other ones, you see the government do what you typically do not see them do, which is use the media. They're out there in the press. They're even working the press behind the scenes. It's not just the big splashy press conference that the U.S. attorney has, which bothers me for different reasons, but they're working the media, leaking things. Should we be concerned about how the U.S. attorney's offices and DOJ are using the press in those kinds of cases? And is there anything we can do about it?
I mean, yes. I mean, I don't know what you can do about it, but I'm kind of new to this, highly publicized case over the past few years. And when you see something leaked, no matter who's leaking, it's not always the government either. It's sometimes defense attorneys who maybe represent a witness or who heard something in a meeting. So it's definitely not, always the Department of Justice, but it's usually not accurate. It's usually kind of accurate, right? And so there's a lot of ways that you can express or tell information to a reporter, and then the reporter reports it in a way that I think will probably benefit her story or benefit whatever narrative. I'm not, even if they have a very flat narrative and they just want to report something, they're still, their job is to have folks read what they write and be interested in what they write. And it's very difficult now because most courts, including the Southern District of Florida and the Southern District of New York, have rules that really prevent the parties from talking about the case after there's been charges. And so you talked about a flashy press conference. There's an argument that that's inconsistent with a lot of local rules. And you and I are sometimes handcuffed in what we're supposed to or allowed to say to the media in ways that the government is not. And unfortunately, we live in a society where folks sometimes do judge a case based upon what they hear right out of the box. And I don't know what to do about it, but if you have any ideas, I'm all ears, because it's definitely a problem.
Right. I mean, I think it is hard to deal with the leaks. That's something that's going to always be difficult to deal with. But I do think that the press conference at the beginning, if prosecutors are going to do it, a defense lawyer has to be able to respond. It is odd to me that the rules have, as you say, sort of handcuffed the defense a lot more than the government. To me, that's a problem, because the government comes out, and we saw it with a speaking indictment, a press conference with a speaking indictment. It puts the defense at a huge disadvantage. We don't have an answer like they do in civil court. We don't get a speaking response. So the only way to respond is by speaking, and we get sometimes in trouble for that. What about cameras in the courtroom? I don't know how it is with state court with Manafort. Were there cameras in the court in state court in New York?
So in New York, they're unique. So as everybody knows, hopefully, or if not, in the federal system, cameras are not allowed. So in the state system, it depends on the state. And in New York, the laws allow, and I might get this slightly off, so forgive me, those who are smarter than me on this issue, but the law allow cameras in the courtroom at certain times, like for the arraignment, and I believe for the disposition, so the guilty plea. But it's really up to the judge's discretion, and many judges don't allow them in, or they maybe will allow 3 reporters with cameras, or some accommodation, but not thousands of cameras. So it's funny with Mr. Manafort, and then I'll talk about actually President Trump for a minute too, because it's a comparison that's worth talking about. So the judge in Mr. Manafort's case said no cameras in the courtroom, but they're allowed in the hallway. Okay. So while on the one hand, that's amazing that they're not going to be snapping photos of Mr. Manafort, sitting in court, they did a perp walk. So they brought Mr. Manafort out from this hallway, way, way down at the other end of the room of before where the courtroom was, and it was lined with reporters and members of the public, none of whom were supporting him, zero. And so he was called more names in that 45-second walk than I had ever heard an individual called in my life. And the reporters, and I mean, there were cameras and pictures, and so that's not the fix either, right? Like you shouldn't and it really is just humiliation, right? That's not, the public doesn't have a need or a right to see somebody humiliated like that. So the judge in that case, I think, was trying to do the right thing and said no cameras in the courtroom, but the rules there allow cameras in the hallways. And then with President Trump, the same thing happened. So in theory, cameras would be allowed for the arraignment. The press applied and said we want to have cameras in there, and what was struck there by the judge is that there would be cameras allowed in to take photos for a few minutes before the procetions started.
You're talking about in state court in New York now.
In state court in New York, totally. Every court, I believe, has its own rules. So that's what happened. So before the judge took the bench, cameras were allowed in, took photos of us and President Trump and the government and the people, and then during the proceeding itself, there were no cameras. Then when President Trump was arraigned in your district, in the District of Florida, there was another application that said, can we please bring cameras in the courtroom or in the courthouse? And the judge, did not grant that application, which isn't unusual. It's not something that happens in federal court. I don't know what you think about it, David. Like, I go both ways. Like, on the one hand, we do live in a country that you're allowed to have public access, and courtrooms shouldn't be sealed. I think we want the public to know what's happening. On the other hand, I do worry that if there's cameras, that witnesses and even lawyers might say or do things differently that doesn't further the process. I don't know. I don't know what your views are on.
No, I've talked a lot about this. I think there should be cameras in the courtroom, especially in a case like yours in the Trump case, because I think the public has a right to see what's going on. I think, by the way, and I think it would help because there's such misinformation out there about the proceedings and about what's happening. And I think we'd get rid of a lot of it if we had cameras. And for example, with your arraignment, like, I don't think Judge Goodman would have done anything differently had there been cameras. I don't think you all would have acted any differently. And I think it would have been good for the public to see what happened. I think, by the way, it might benefit the defendant in a lot of cases. I think people are worried that it would hurt the defendant. And that idea of the perp walk just drives me bananas, how they use that. And it reminds me of, the Game of Thrones, like shame, 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 walking down.
Yeah, that's a very good analogy. It's exactly what it was like with Game of Thrones. Dead on.
Right. So, I think there should be cameras. I wonder what the clients would think of it. Your current client might like it. Some others may not. I don't know. But I think it would probably benefit the public. But so turning back to Manafort for a second. So you obviously get this motion filed, and lots of folks seem to actually support it, which you must have been a little surprised, at least because of everything that had gone on to date.
Yes, I was, for sure. And look, I had these rock star lawyers who work with me at Cadwalader who did the writing, right, to make me look good, and we did it together, and it was a really complicated brief, and there were a lot of open issues because the jury had hung in the Eastern District of Virginia. The jury had hung on several counts, and then at sentencing, like what often happens, those counts are dismissed, right? So are they dismissed with prejudice or without prejudice? And then maybe the judge says something that suggests it's with prejudice, but doesn't affirmatively say it. And then I think the judgment had a box check that suggested it was the opposite. And so it was a typical kind of, nothing is perfect in our jobs. And we put together a brief, and I thought it was really good. I mean, I didn't think there was really an alternative, but on the other hand, we very rarely win briefs in motions to dismiss indictments, right? I mean, the white collar bar, as we all have talked about, and you talked about this, on the show, we usually lose, right? Or we call victories things that maybe aren't really victories,
True.
And so, and look, the prosecutors from the New York folks were very courteous and professional, and I don't have anything bad to say about them. They put their brief in, and the Judge Wiley had scheduled a date in December where he was going to issue a decision, which is his practice. That's what he does, apparently, or that's what I've been told he does. And so Mr. Manafort's going to come back in December. Everybody thinks it's been denied. Let's set a trial date. And he just doesn't show up. And so as criminal defense attorneys who are listening to this know, you often have no idea what's happening with prisoner transports and where your client is and why he's not showing up or where. And he just wasn't showing up. And for a while, for several days, I didn't know where he was. And it sounds funny to say that, but I had talked to him almost every day in Loretto, or very frequently, about what was going on and next steps and getting the decision. And he just dropped off the face of the earth, and nobody would tell me anything. And he's supposed to be in New York to get this decision, which we think we're going to lose. And he's not in New York, but I don't know where he is. He's not in Loretto either. And so it turns out, just to jump ahead, he had a health issue and had been taken to the hospital. And when they take somebody to the hospital, that's a federal inmate, they don't tell the world because they don't want something to happen with security. So they were intentionally not telling anybody anything. And I actually got a call from a reporter, and the reporter said to me, "Do you know anything about where your client is?" I said, "No, I have no idea. Do you?" And the reporter said, "Yep, I do. I have a leak that tells me that your client's in the hospital and is totally fine, but is in the hospital, is not coming to court." And so anyway, so to make a long story short, the judge says, "I still want to have it, even though Mr. Manafort can't show up. I still want you guys to show up." And we walk in, and it was one of those freaking really surreal moments that we experience as litigators, where the judge had left copies of his opinion on the table where we would all go and sit down. We were called up, and it was filled with kind of reporters, and it was state court, so it's very noisy. And of course, all you do is you race to the very last page to see what the decision was. Right. And I see the DAs doing the same thing. And it says, the motion's dismissed, motion granted, the indictment is dismissed. And I didn't know what to say, right? Because I just didn't know what to say. And Judge Wiley, a really nice guy, and he has a great reputation. Putting aside what his decision in this case, everybody, when we got assigned him to a person, everybody said he was a fair judge and everything else. I don't remember the exact words, but he said something like, "Well, that's my decision. I don't think there's anything else to tell you." There wasn't. What else do you do? The indictment's dismissed. It's over.
And you didn't. Your client wasn't even there, so you could tell.
No,
so how do you get in touch with them? How do you tell them?
So I go back, and at this point, I knew that he had been at prison. So in the hospital. Someone had leaked it to me. So I had found out that he had returned to Loretto. He was okay. It was a health scare that was nothing. And they put him on the phone with me, and he had gotten back to prison. And apparently inmates were like literally giving him standing ovations because he had won. And so he already knew when I called him, but he was obviously extraordinarily emotional. He did hope that President Trump would pardon him. And so this really was a very important part of the process, because if he got pardoned but was still doing state time, it's hardly, the pardon is almost irrelevant. It's just for the federal crimes. Anyway, it was pretty incredible. And then, the people appealed to the first department. And so we argued that, and we won, unanimous. It really wasn't a close case, David. Like, people say to me, "You're a genius for winning that case." And I say two things. One, my rock star colleagues wrote the brief. And two, it was a per se violation of the Constitution of the state of New York. So
I hear you. But let me, as you said before, any win for a criminal defendant, especially pre-trial, is so incredible, Todd. And you should savor it and embrace it, because as you know, it's so rare and amazing.
Yeah.
So congratulations. And you mentioned one other thing I wanted to talk about, which is the pardon. So eventually, President Trump pardons Manafort and he gets out. How much time did he do?
So he ended up doing a couple of years. What happened in the middle of all that was, of course, COVID. And he was very high risk because of his age primarily, but some other health issues. And so we were able to, and by the way, he had a lot of, I don't want to say friends, but he had a lot of folks within the Department of Justice and the Bureau of Prisons that didn't feel that he had gotten a fair shake. And I don't know whether that's fair or not, but it happens to be the truth. And so we had gotten the BOP to release him to his home pretty early. I think COVID really shut us down in March. By May, Mr. Manafort was home in Virginia because of COVID, which was great for him because remarkably, as you recall at the time, these prisons, the inmates were saying, we got to get out now in case there's an outbreak. And the government was saying, there's no outbreak. So what are you saying that for? And so that was an issue we dealt with in Loretto. After he left, there was a major COVID outbreak in Loretto, and it was rampant and it was horrible. And so thank God, he was released when he was to home confinement. So he had been on home confinement. So he ultimately did, I think, 2 years, maybe a little more than 2 years. I don't remember exactly. And then he was home. And then when the election results came in, there was a lot of discussion about when he would get pardoned. And we were talking to folks and nobody really knew. It's a very powerful, it's a very powerful option for one person in this country, which is the president. And so I found out the morning it was happening, again from a reporter who called me and said that that Paul Manafort's on the list and the president's going to pardon him today. And I remember calling Paul and telling him that, and he, I think to this day, maybe he'll listen to this and learn the truth, thinks that I had some incredible source at the White House, like I was really plugged in. I was not plugged in. I just had reporters who were, and so. And then he was pardoned, right? And then it's over, and it's really, he ended up getting his property back that had been seized, not all of it, but a lot of it, and so his life was not restored in any way, shape, or form. But he did recover a little bit of what he had lost during that process, and so it was a very fulfilling, putting aside whether the folks listening here like the guy or don't like the guy,
right?
As far as it goes, for those of us that do this for a living, it was a very successful and fulfilling effort.
It is interesting that you say that, Todd, because I will say the political cases where you represent a client that is, has one political bent or another, you get more hate mail, hate comments than if you represent a violent criminal or anybody. I mean, you get the political stuff these days draws more animosity and hatred. It's too bad that that's the way it is, and I'm sure you're going through a lot of that now.
Yes,
which is difficult, and the criminal defense bar owes it to you to commend you for being a true criminal defense lawyer and dealing with all that, because it's not easy. Let me ask you one last thing while I got you, and I don't even know if you can talk about this or not, but is the Manafort case how you ended up in your current position representing the former president?
A little bit. So after I represented Mr. Manafort, I had an opportunity to represent Igor Fruman, who was one of the folks, along with Lev Parnas, who were associated with Rudy Giuliani, and they were charged. They were famously arrested right before they boarded a flight at Dulles Airport to go to overseas, and that was another very politically charged prosecution. I'm not saying politically charged in a way that is derogatory towards the feds. Just it was politically charged, without a doubt, as the public viewed it as such, and it led, at least loosely led, to the impeachment proceedings against Trump, or at least it was part of it. And so I had a fair amount of publicity, for lack of a better word, from that representation. And so that happened. And then about a year ago, not quite a year ago, 10 months ago, I started representing Boris Epstein. And so he is obviously he works with President Trump daily. He's one of his lawyers and a consultant for him. And so it was through that representation, but also Mr. Manafort, that led to me having the opportunity to represent President Trump. I know that there was a lot of due diligence done by folks about me that included talking to Mr. Manafort and others about that experience. And so, yes, I think for sure that's what allowed me to do what I'm doing now. And it's a very extremely challenging case for reasons that everybody should probably appreciate. But I also, it's also really historic, not only the case in Miami, but the state case as well, where you have a district attorney indicting, a former president of the United States. That has never, ever happened before. And so being part of something where most of your briefing or most of your arguments, at some point you're saying to the judge, this has never happened before, right? And it's true, it hasn't. That is a very kind of, I don't know, like, what are you doing this for if you don't want to do something like that, So
well, you're handling it with grace, and it's not easy. I know you must be bombarded with all kinds of stuff. So keep up the fight, and I want to thank you for being on the show. It was great, Todd. I don't know if you remember, we met years ago at one of these conferences at the Forum, and it's great to see how successful and how great you're doing now. So I thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thank you very much, David. And I'll say that, as I said to you when we first talked about this, I don't talk about my career or my life, but there was one place when I readily said yes to, and that was to be able to hang out with you for an hour. So thank you, and it was great.
That was really cool. You can tell Todd is just a really nice guy, good guy, and it's not hard to understand why he's getting some of the biggest, most important cases out there right now. I'm very thankful that he sat down with me to do this interview. You can imagine he's underwater, swamped with representing the former president in two different cases, both in New York and Miami, and possibly other cases to come. So I want to thank Todd for being on the show and for spending some time with me discussing his representation of Paul Manafort and other cases. And we'll be back next week on July 4th with Jerry Lefcourt, another New York legend. So thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed the interview with Todd Blanche in For the Defense.